without further ado, I would like to introduce Angus Carroll. So Angus is one of the two co-curators of the Darwin Dinosaurs exhibit that we've been fortunate to have here at the Museum of Idaho for the last few months. Angus collects rare books, and his Darwin collection, as he was just talking about with us, now totals several thousand volumes, including first editions of all of Darwin's books and the first printing of The Origin of Species in 39 languages. Is that still the right number, Angus, 39?
40 now.
Congratulations. And so Angus is also a dinosaur enthusiast, as you might expect. And so Carroll often joins his co-curator, Mike Trebold, who is president of the Rocky Mountain Dinosaur Resource Center in the field. Angus has thereby found several dinosaurs on his own, including a Triceratops and a Mosasaur. And if that's not enough, by day, Carroll is also president of an internet software company. So here to talk about the main concepts of evolution in the context of Darwin and dinosaurs, I turn the time over to Angus Carroll.
All right, thank you. I am one of the co-curators of the Darwin and Dinosaurs Museum exhibition. I'm glad to be here today. And in this presentation, we're going to take a look at the events that led to Darwin's discovery of the natural selection and the main concepts of evolution. I will move quickly through the slides because there's a lot to cover in 45 minutes, but I'm sure we'll have lots of time for questions at the end. Darwin and Dinosaurs exhibit is designed to tell the story of Darwin's life and work and how he came up with the theory of natural selection. And dinosaurs figure prominently in this story because they help set the stage for a new worldview, just as Darwin was setting out on his famous voyage. In fact, had Darwin set out on his voyage 25 years earlier, the result would have been much different. The photo here is of a Albertosaur attacking a juvenile ceratopsian, which is in the exhibit. Which you can see if you go there. And we will not only start with dinosaurs, but we'll end with them, because not only did they kick off the story of modern evolutionary theory, but they're a great example of evolution themselves. This scene on the slide now is also in the museum exhibit. This is 3 dromaeosaurs, small predatory theropods, attacking a larger animal, a Pachycephalosaurus, what they call the bone-headed dinosaur. His skull was about 6 inches thick. Mike Trebold, my partner, actually discovered this particular specimen, the only complete Pachycephalosaur ever found. So we'll start at the beginning. And the beginning of the story actually goes back to the late 18th century when a person named James Hutton started looking around Scotland and England. In true Victorian fashion, Hutton was many things. He was a physician, a chemist, a scientist, a farmer, one of the first what we now call gentleman scientists of the Victorian period. And he explored all areas of the natural world, trying to understand what he saw. He went on an expedition throughout Scotland. He went to many places. One of them was Sicker Point, which is the photo that you're seeing in front of you now. And what he noticed here is that the rocks on top, which are basically horizontal, as you would expect, sit on top of rocks that are clearly stratified near upwards. And he concluded that the rocks could only be deformed like that by tremendous forces, and concluded that they could only happen over a long period of time, driven by pressure and heat from inside the earth. And so Hutton was the first scientist to propose what we now call uniformitism, whereby what we see today geologically is the result of erosion and upheaval over millions of years, and not the result of sudden catastrophes like the flood. Now, we should just make a side note here that, of course, we know now that meteors hit the Earth occasionally, and indeed there are times of catastrophic change, but those are rare and special cases, and we must hope they remain so. Back to Hutton, he published his paper in 1788 called The Theory of the Earth, and he followed that with a 3-volume work in 1795. Unfortunately, you can't read anything he writes. It is so dense, it would overwhelm the most determined reader. In fact, if you ever can't get to sleep, just pick up his book, Theory of the Earth, and 5 pages later, you will be asleep. So this is the most famous tooth in the world. This is the tooth that Gideon Mantell found in 1822, I believe. There's many stories about this tooth, that Gideon found it himself, that his wife found it while Gideon Mantell was a country doctor, and one of the stories is that his wife found it while he was in seeing somebody and she was waiting out by the carriage, and another story is that he bought it from someone in a quarry, and all versions appear in the record somewhere, so no one really knows how it was found. In any case, it's the tooth that kicked off dinosaurs. Mantell, being a doctor, realized that it looked an awful lot like a tooth from an iguana, except if you scaled the iguana up for this tooth size, this tooth is about 2 inches long, incidentally, in real life, you would have a 40-foot iguana. And he named this hypothetical monster Iguanodon, which literally means iguana tooth. At first he was ridiculed. You know, the other scientists all, you know, come on, giant iguanas. But he was borne out when other bones were discovered. This tooth that you're looking at right now is now in New Zealand because Gideon's son took it there when he moved to New Zealand. It now resides in the Te Papa Museum in Wellington. So just when they were making fun of him and saying that there were no such thing as giant iguanas, William Buckland acquired a set of bones from a quarry near Stonesfield in Sussex. And it included a jaw that was clearly from a large carnivore and clearly from one that doesn't exist today. He beat Mantell to the punch because Buckland published the first scientific description of a dinosaur in 1825, just ahead of when our friend Dr. Mantell got organized and issued a paper on the Iguanodon. Interestingly enough, it's not the first depiction of a dinosaur bone to appear in a book. In the Robert Plott's book, The Natural History of Oxfordshire in 1677, there is actually a picture of a dinosaur bone, but they didn't know what it was and they thought it was the femur from a biblical giant. It does turn out, coincidentally, that it was in fact a femur from a Megalosaurus, no less. Anyway, dinosaurs became quite the thing. Even Dickens got in on it. If you read the opening lines of Bleak House, you'll see that he refers to the Megalosaurus, and everybody was talking about dinosaurs. They, of course, tried to figure out how to put them together. They only had a few bones and a few teeth, and so mistakes were made. And this is one of the original depictions of the Megalosaurus, and here is a modern reconstruction of the Megalosaurus. And you can see they're quite different. In addition, on the Iguanodon has a spike on each hand called a thumb spike, and they only found one. They didn't know what it was, so they put it on his nose. And we should also point out that it was not only men that were discovering dinosaurs. In fact, Mary Anning was one of the most successful and famous fossil hunters of all time. Her family was very poor. They sold fossils to tourists who came down to the southern shores of England near Lyme Regis in Dorset for vacation. And she was the inspiration for the rhyme. I can see if I can say this correctly. She sells seashells by the seashore. This scene was painted by a friend of hers, the geologist Henry de la Beche. He incorporated all of her major discoveries. In fact, that main scene is an ichthyosaur, which she discovered, the first one, biting the neck of a long-necked plesiosaur, which she was the first to discover. And above them are flying the dimorphodons, a small pterosaur, which she also discovered. And you also notice in this picture that everybody's eating something. You know, this is a real dinosaur-y dinosaur world. Oh, let me see here. Anyway, the result of these discoveries was a new worldview, that the Earth is very old and that many species go extinct. And both of these were new ideas at the time, in the early 19th century. And then along comes Charles Darwin. And Darwin was born in Shrewsbury in England in 1809. He was not a remarkable student for the first little while. He was sent to Edinburgh University to study medicine, but he couldn't bear to watch the surgical demonstrations. This was pre-anesthesia, and operations were pretty grisly affairs back then. So he switched to Cambridge, where he studied for the clergy, and he became famous as a bug collector. What you're seeing here are some of the bugs that he collected while he was a student at Cambridge. These are now in the Cambridge University Museum. And in his bio, in order to explain just how ardent a collector he was, he tells a story of the three beetles. He was out one day and he had a beetle in one hand, and he saw another beetle that he didn't have, so he grabbed it with his other hand. And then he saw another beetle that he just had to have, so he took one of the beetles in his hands and he put it in his mouth so he could grab the other beetle. But the beetle he put in his mouth excreted this awful acidic solution, and he had to spit it out. And in any case, he lost all three beetles. So he was quite the naturalist or budding naturalist at Cambridge University. Indeed, the first time Darwin is ever cited in a scientific book is in 1829, when he contributed a moth to a major study of British bugs called Stevens' Illustrations of British Entomology. And he wrote in his biography that no poet ever felt more delight at seeing his first poem published than he did when he saw his name in print in Stevens' book. So now Darwin graduates from Cambridge, and right out of university, he gets the opportunity of a lifetime, the opportunity of any lifetime, and that is to sail around the world on a Navy expedition, which was being sent to South America to map the bottom half of South America, an area known as Tierra del Fuego, the land of fire, where shipping routes needed accurate information because it was very dangerous to go around the southern tip of South America. It still is. And it's a miracle he got on the boat at all, because his father didn't want him to go. He thought it was a waste of time and he should just go get a job, which just shows that fathers never change. And the captain, Robert Fitzroy, thought his nose wasn't right. Fitzroy was a student of Lavater, who was famous for his theories of physiognomy, which is where you can tell a lot about someone by looking at their face. It's a lot like phrenology, where you look at the top of their head. And he thought Darwin's nose indicated he lacked the constitution necessary for the voyage. But Darwin later wrote to his sister, after he had met with Fitzroy, that he had convinced Fitzroy his nose had lied. And so he got on the voyage. And he came across, well, first of all, in this depiction here, you can see that this is Darwin, the Beagle's simplified route when it went to South America. It's actually, you know, they went back and forth and up and down, and it's terribly complicated. But this is basically the only comprehensible way to show the route that they took around South America. And he came across three clues that proved to be very important to him. And the first one he came across at Bahia Blanco. And here he found the bones of some giant extinct animals. One of them was a giant sloth. You can see that on the right. It's called the Mylodon. And the other is the Glyptodon, which is a precursor, an ancient ancestor of modern day armadillos. And what Darwin knew is that both of these animals, armadillos and sloths, exist today. There are modern species of both of these animals, but clearly these two did not exist because they were incredibly large. That armadillo is about the size of a Volkswagen. In fact, the armadillo, the Glyptodon, I should say, it's not really an armadillo as being an ancestor, but lived into the Holocene, and there is evidence that some early South American peoples hunted them and lived in their shells. So they're pretty big. And that sloth is huge. He's like 30 feet long. So Darwin noticed and concluded that this is an important fact, that there are different species of the same type of animal in different periods of time. So that was one of his first clues. His second clue happened when he got down to Patagonia, which is just the name of there's no country named Patagonia now. This would be modern day Uruguay. And he met what were then called the Patagonians and learned that there were two rheas. Rheas are a flightless bird. They're a lot like an ostrich or an emu. And he learned that there were two, a large one and a small one. And he learned that the large one lived only north of the Rio Negro River, and the little one lived only to the south. And he was a little puzzled by that because he didn't understand why there would be two rheas. But he also realized that the river represented an actual geographic barrier because these are flightless birds. So modern day thinking on this is that the population originally lived north of the river. There was a drought, and at some time the river was passable and some small population made it to the south side of the river. Then they got re-separated when the river went back to its original levels, and the populations then diverged because they are now living in slightly different environments, and each population is subject to its own slightly different mutations that take place genetically, forcing the two populations aside. Anyway, Darwin didn't know all that back then, of course, but he did think that, isn't it strange that the two slightly different species are separated by a river and live in slightly different environments. And the third clue he got was geological. When they had finally rounded the Horn, which was no small thing, it was very dangerous down here. They almost capsized. Fitzroy was a man of few words, and they had to put out to sea for 6 weeks out down south of the tip of South America. They couldn't go near the land because they would have been dashed on the rocks. The weather was so violent. And Fitzroy, at one point, they, when you're in weather like that, you try to go into the waves sort of head on. And one wave knocked them sideways, and another wave knocked them on their side. And one of the gunwales was actually underwater. That's how close they came to sinking. And Fitzroy wrote in his book, on that day, we were sorely tried, which is a great understatement. Anyway, when he was around there on Koloe, the island of Koloe, not to be confused with Chloe, who is on this call, he experienced an earthquake and a volcano, which of course were related. And the town of Conception on the west coast of South America was totally destroyed. Darwin, always observant, investigated the effect on the shoreline, and he realized by looking at recent marine fossils, shells, that the shoreline had actually risen 9 feet. And that's what made him realize that people like James Hutton and Hutton's subsequent protege, Charles Lyell, who had theorized that continents and mountains are formed in these small incremental steps, he realized that they were right, which gave further credence to the idea that the Earth was much older than we thought. In any case, so he's got 3 major clues in South America, and then he heads to the Galapagos Islands. And he would spend 5 weeks there, or the Beagle would spend 5 weeks there, and Darwin would come across another very important clue. The Galapagos Islands are about 600 miles off the coast of Ecuador on the west coast of South America, northern South America. In the top right, you can see the little box. You can't actually see the islands in there. And they're volcanic islands, which means they've never been connected to the mainland. They spring up from the bottom of the ocean floor. They're not continental islands, which appear because changing water levels create, straits and water pathways. So they are sort of pristine in the sense that they were never really part of South America. And one thing that's really fascinating about the Galapagos Islands is that not only are they famous as a symbol of evolutionary theory, but they're evolving themselves because they're known what are called volcanic chain islands. And the way this works is there's a hot spot in the mantle. And if you look in the top left, this could be the island of San Cristobal, for example. The mantle, the plate, the mantle doesn't move. The plate above it does move. The Galapagos Islands sit on what is called the Nazca Plate, and it is moving eastward towards South America at about, I think it's 3 or 4 inches a year. And the hot spot doesn't move, so it punches up an island into the plate, like San Cristobal labeled here, and then San Cristobal moves away closer to South America, and it pumps up a new volcano, and you get a new island like Santa Cruz. And you keep doing this, and you'll notice that as the islands move towards South America, they also erode down because they're no longer being pushed up and built by the hot spot from the mantle, they're now just subject to the erosion of wind and water and rain and the ocean. And so the islands themselves are evolving, if it weren't enough that, that they played such an important role in evolutionary theory itself. And in fact, if you look here, you can see that this is a topographical representation of the islands. And you can see that the volcanoes, several of which are still active today, or are active today, are on the left side, the western side, and that the islands don't have the same mountainous features on the right because they're moving towards South America and they are eroding down. The hot spot is right under Fernandina right now. And so that is what is creating the volcano, the active volcano on the island of Fernandina. Darwin made 5 landings when he was in the Galapagos. And to some degree, they were all important, but the real key one is number 5. This is on the island of Santiago. And it's here where he really got a taste for the tortoises, because a local person told him, I can tell just by looking at a tortoise what island it came from. And Darwin was fascinated by that idea. He wondered, why would tortoises be slightly different on each island? And the truth is there's 2 major types. This is one of the greatest photos in evolutionary theory. This is sort of a setup, right? This is at the Galapagos sanctuary, and these 2 tortoises normally wouldn't meet because they would live on different islands, but they're both at the sanctuary, and then they got them both to lift their heads. I don't know how they did that. They probably held up a branch of, you know, some tasty morsel to get them to do that. But this is the perfect example to understand the difference between the dome-shaped tortoise on the left and what is called the saddle-shaped tortoise on the right. And you'll see that in the saddle-shaped tortoise, his carapace flares up over his neck, and that allows him to reach higher. The saddle-shaped tortoises also have slightly larger, longer forelimbs, so they can reach higher. And they live on the islands where vegetation is not available on the ground. So the dome-shaped tortoises live on like Fernandina and Isabella, and they're very lush islands, and there's lots of vegetation on the ground, and they don't need to raise their head, and the other guys do. Oh, got ahead of myself there. So anyway, Darwin realized that this was a critical insight, that the tortoises would be slightly different, as if they had started on one island and moved to the others and adapted to the slightly different environments on each island. And he knew that was important right away. In fact, he even wrote in his diary how important this would be to the understanding how species evolve. His finches are more famous, but he really didn't understand the finches until he got back to England, when the ornithologist John Gould recognized that they represented 13 different species. And so later, after Darwin was back in England, the finches began to play a very important role in his thinking. But while he was on the voyage, it was the tortoises that showed him the way to understand the changes. So Darwin then gets back from the voyage, and he's writing up his work. It's 1836. He's got a lot of work to do. He puts out 3 books on geology and a massive 5-volume set on zoology from all of his specimens and discoveries that he's made on his voyage. But in 1838, he reads a book by a man named Thomas Malthus. Thomas Malthus was a British economist, and he wrote a book in 1798 called Essay on Population. Darwin probably didn't read that first edition. He probably read the 1826 6th edition, but they both say basically the same thing. Malthus made the point that a population, if left to its own and unchecked, will double every generation. In other words, 2 people will have 4 kids, and the 4 kids will pair up, and they'll each have 4 kids, and pretty soon you're going 2, 4, 8, 16, etc. But the food supply cannot double that fast. And therefore, you're going to end up, there has to be something that prevents the population from doubling. Malthus was interested in the socioeconomic impact or meaning of this, what is now called the Malthusian problem or the Malthusian Catastrophe. But Darwin realized instantly that it applied to the natural world. In other words, if more offspring were born than could be fed, there must be competition. And who would win that competition? The animals best suited to the environment, to compete in the environment. So Malthus was a critical insight to Darwin. And let's talk about elephants. Darwin used elephants as an example in The Origin. So we are going to go through a very similar argument to what Darwin did. If elephants doubled, unchecked, here's what would happen after 15 generations. You'd start with 2, then you'd have 4, 8, 16, 32, etc. And it seems after 15 generations, okay, so what? There's 32,000 elephants. Today there's about 440,000 elephants in the world. So that doesn't seem impossible. But that's just the beginning, because the thing about exponential growth is that it is exponential. And so after only 30 generations, you end up with 1 billion elephants. And it's, you feel free to check the math here. There's no trick. This is the nature of exponential growth. When you double from 32, like in generation 5, you just end up with 64. It doesn't seem like such a big deal. But in generation 29, if you have 500 million elephants and you double, you have 1 billion. And it just gets sillier, because after 45 generations, you have 35 trillion elephants. And just to end our little display here, we'll just go and say after 60 generations, you have 1.1 quintillion elephants. We know that that doesn't happen. We know that physically can't happen. For instance, just as an example, I'm just going to point to 50 generations. So at 50 generations, which is 1,000 years, incidentally, elephant generations are about 20 years, you would have 1.1 quadrillion elephants. Now, if you look down on an elephant from above, he's about 10 feet long and 5 feet wide. So we're just going to call it 50 square feet. Well, if you had 1.1 quadrillion elephants, you would cover the entire land surface of the Earth, which is 196 million square miles. So clearly, we don't have that many elephants. And that's the first fact that plays into what we call the model of natural selection. And that is that the environment cannot support all the individuals that are born. There is either not enough food, or they are killed through other ways, either through predators, or they are unable to find mates through competition. So the environment, you just have to think about fish. I mean, fish lay like 10,000 eggs at a time. We'd be knee deep in fish if all the fish survived. So the animals don't survive. The environment simply cannot support all of the offspring that are born. So now let's talk about variation. This is a great visual. This is a visual where each person's skin color has been matched to their PMS color. This was done by an artist in South America. And she did hundreds of thousands of them. This is just a tiny sample. But skin color is, no different than height or eye color or any other genetically determined physical trait. And you can see in our own species that there's tremendous variation. And this is true in all species. So, it's not just humans. I use humans to show the variation because we only really see variation in our own species, because that's part of our own ability to deal with our colleagues. But you could tell, of course, a giant dog from a little dog. But if I showed you 4 dogs that were of the same subbreed, you'd have a hard time telling them apart unless you knew them well. But the variation is there, just like I'm showing with this slide here with people. You think about it, I think about it as what I call the theory of Michael Phelps' feet. Michael Phelps is the most successful Olympic athlete of all time. He's won 23 gold medals. No matter how hard you and I trained, even if we started when we were 2, we could never swim as fast as Michael Phelps. And why is that? It's because he has size 14 feet. They're like flippers. And if he were a marine mammal, he would have a tremendous advantage. Now, in the human world, we have the ability to control or mitigate our environment to a great degree. So we don't see the same effect of slightly different physical characteristics and how they impact our ability to compete. but it is surely true in the natural world. Some gazelles are bigger and faster than others. Some are slightly different colors and have better camouflage. Others are more skittish. In the natural world, these slight differences confer advantage, which results in more offspring. And even though we're different as people, the underlying machinery is exactly the same. For all life on Earth, it starts with your DNA. And DNA is nothing but a really long molecule of base pairs. In the human genome, there's about 3 billion base pairs in your DNA, in each strand of DNA. And sections of that DNA, like in showing in this example here, these 1, 2, first of all, I should say, think of DNA as triplets. Like every 3 base pairs actually represents what is called an amino acid. And so it's like a chemical. So every 3 of these spells out, GGA means glycine. And a gene is nothing more than a string of these triplets. And that's a gene. And then on each end, there's a triplet that actually means stop. And so that's how the body, the RNA, knows I start here at the blue and I end here. And what it does is the RNA unwinds the DNA, reads this code, moves off and assembles the amino acids coded here and creates a protein. And that protein is what regulates most cell metabolisms. So DNA basically is a way of just storing the code of how to create proteins. And there's 2 proteins I'll talk about here. So OCA2, which stands for the oculocutaneous albinism 2 gene, and HERC2. And I don't know what HERC2 stands for. I actually tried to look it up this morning. I couldn't find it. So I'm not sure what HERC2 means. But they are actually right beside each other on chromosome 15. And they are responsible for the production of melanin. So OCA2, this gene here, spells out how to build protein P. And protein P regulates melanin. Melanin is a pigment that makes your skin brown and your eyes brown. Protein P has to bind with a specific site on the HERC2 gene in order to produce melanin. So there is a mutation on the HERC2 gene, 1 base pair out of 3 billion base pairs, 1 base pair mutated, and we ended up with people with blue eyes. And here's how that happened. Protein P needs this site to bind to regulate melanin. If the site is not there, protein P can't make enough melanin. So the melanin goes to your skin first and not to your eyes because it's more important for your skin. And so you end up with no melanin in your eyes. And when there's no melanin in your eyes, they're blue. They're not actually blue in the sense that there's any color blue. They're structurally blue. So they're actually clear, but because of the way blue light is refracted, they appear to be blue. It's the same effect you see in the sky. It's called the Rayleigh dispersion. And what that means is that because blue has a longer wavelength, it bounces around more, and so you see more blue than any other color. So people with blue eyes don't actually have blue eyes. They just look like they have blue eyes. And the reason they look like they have blue eyes is because of 1 base pair change on the HERC2 gene. This is why you have to have both parents with the HERC2 mutation. The HERC2 mutation is a recessive gene. So if even one of your parents has a normal HERC2 gene, you don't get blue eyes because you get lots of melanin. You only need 1 binding site. But if both your parents have the HERC2 gene with the mutation, then you can't produce enough melanin and you end up with blue eyes. Anyway, the main point of all of that is that variation is inheritable and it's subject to mutation. So all the time mutations are happening. Because when you are transcripting and translating and replicating all of the processes that go on to take DNA and create proteins, errors are made. And in most cases, they don't matter. And in some cases, they're deleterious and they you don't survive because you've got some real problem. You can't produce insulin or something. But now and then, a mutation is advantageous. And in fact, with the blue gene, the blue eyes gene, the theory now is that all goes back to 1 person 5 to 10,000 years ago in Europe, where that one person had the gene mutation, and that caused blue eyes. And that was such an advantage in mating that now something like 30 or 40% of Northern Europeans have blue eyes. That's how attractive that was when it first emerged as a new novel mutation in the human population. The main thing here is that you can inherit variation. And now let's talk about what that means. Let's talk about gazelles, because now we're going to talk about selection. So if you're a fast gazelle, you will live longer, if only because you can outrun lions better than slow gazelles. So let's just take a look at what happens here to an evolving population. We start with 50% are fast and 50% are slow. But each fast gazelle has two offspring, which are fast because they inherit the fast gene. And the slower offspring only has time to have one offspring and then gets eaten by the lion. And this happens generation after generation. And you can see what happens here. The gazelles don't change. This gazelle lived and died and he was fast. He lived and died and he was fast. This lived and died and he was slow. But the population now, whereas it once was 50% of slow and fast, is now 80% fast and only 20% slow. And that's because the slow gazelles have been eaten and are not producing as many offspring who have the slow gene. This is the logic of natural selection. And when you put these three together, this is what you get. You get the environment can't support all the individuals that are born. There is an inheritable variation among individuals of the same species, and there are constant mutations refreshing that variation. And the logic, which is in it, and those two are just facts. I mean, they can be observed empirically and shown to be true. The next step is logic. The individuals with advantage survive longer and have more offspring. And that there is no escaping that logic. And the result is the population evolves. So the fact here is that natural selection inevitably drives what we call microevolution, such as faster gazelles. And on the unfortunate side, antibiotic resistance. There's no question natural selection is in effect. We've actually observed it. We observe it in the lab. We observe it in the Galapagos Islands. Peter and Rosemary Grant have spent 30 years on Daphne Major, which is a small island in the Galapagos, studying the finches, and have shown how the finches change each year depending on how much water there is, because there's a huge effect of El Nino on the Galapagos, and the islands go through drought and lots of water and drought and so forth. They go through all of these unpredictable climatic changes that change the vegetation, that change the food source, that change the birds. So the fact that natural selection results in microevolution is indisputed or indisputable. If anyone says that they have a hard time with microevolution being the result of natural selection, then they're just not thinking, because these are facts, this is inescapable logic, and this is the result. The real question is, can natural selection and microevolution explain macroevolution? Can it explain all of the fantastic diversity of life we see on the planet today? Darwin thought so. He thought that small changes brought about by natural selection over time would accumulate and eventually result in new species. So let's talk about finches, and let's see just how that might work. There are 14 species of finch in the Galapagos today. There's a 15th that are part of this family, but they live on Cocos Island, which is a separate island system north of the Galapagos. Anyway, what's interesting about the Galapagos finches is they're not finches. They're actually tanagers. But skipping over that and just continuing to call them finches for simplicity, let's try to understand what happened in the Galapagos. As we said earlier, the Galapagos are volcanic islands. There is no connection to South America. So it's not that they split off from South America and they brought some finches with them. What happened was a founder flock from South America, warblers, made it to the Galapagos Islands. And they had no competition. They were insect eaters, as they were in South America, and they thought, wow, this is great. There's no one else here. We'll eat all the insects. And so they did fine. And they went to different islands. And so you ended up with warblers on most of the major islands in the Galapagos. Well, on one island, there was a lot of alternative food sources. There were fruit and flowers and other vegetarian food sources that they started to exploit. Maybe because there was an El Nino event and there weren't enough insects. So, you know, rather than just lay down and die, they said, well, we'll eat whatever's here. And so they tried different foods, and pretty soon those foods, buds and leaves and flowers, became the mainstay of their diet. And as a result of that, they developed different behaviors, different songs. They started to look different because food affects all sorts of physiological aspects of an organism. So even if they then met one of the warblers from one of the other islands, they wouldn't mate with them because they wouldn't recognize them. They could mate with them, they just don't, because they go, you're not, you know, you're not one of me. You know, in the Galapagos itself, you see many of the complicated and nuanced mating rituals between birds. You see it in the blue-footed booby, you see it in the albatross, and you see it in other birds as well. Birds recognize each other through a very complex system of sound and sight and action that tells them you are my species, and up and above that you are healthy, and therefore I will mate with you. So this population gets separated. They're on another island. They start exploiting a local food source. They get to be a little different. They stop mating. Eventually, mutations within this subpopulation add up, and mutations within the normal warbler population add up, and they become genetically incompatible. So now they can't mate even if they wanted to. This goes on, and we end up with what are called the tree finch group. So we have finches that specialize in the mangrove forests on Isabel Island, and we end up with the woodpecker, the finch woodpecker on the Galapagos, and trees. And we end up with seed eaters. This is over millions of years. And we end up with cactus eaters, because food being so important to how many individuals can survive in a species, that every food source eventually is exploited if it can be. So if a bird can eat cactus, you'll end up with a bird that does eat cactus. So I'll just say one thing about the sharp-beaked, because I labeled him the anything eaters here, because the sharp-beaked finch actually steals eggs from other birds and rolls them against rocks and breaks them open and eats the eggs. And they also go up to the blue-footed booby and peck at the blue-footed booby's legs until they bleed and they drink their blood. And so they're actually called the vampire finch. Although that's a little unfair because they don't eat just blood. They're an all-purpose bird, and they'll eat anything. And so what you end up with is birds that look a little different, sound a little different. Here are the different beak shapes that we see in the Galapagos today, depending on how they, what food source they exploit. The large ground finch has a huge beak and crack open the largest seeds. The woodpecker, a little longer but stout because he's driving into the wood of the trees. And the small tree finch has to catch insects as they go by. And so he has a very short beak that is more precisely controlled. So what you see here is a species starts off, let's say this is species 1 of a finch. There's variance within the population. A small population gets separated by water in this case. Could be a mountain, but in this case it's water. That variant continues to change. At all times, all parents could mate or breed with their offspring. There's no clean break. What there is a don't period in between. So these two could mate, these two don't, 1 and 3. And 1 and 4, or 1 and 2 in this case as labeled, cannot mate because they have eventually become genetically incompatible. But at no time is it impossible for a parent, at no time is the difference so great between parent and offspring that they cannot mate. This was one of the main challenges to evolutionary theory in the early days, when people said, well, that means that if there's a speciation event, then at some point the offspring is a new species, could not mate with its own parent. And that is not true. That is not what happens. That theory leaves out the don't category. They originally can, they originally can mate, then they don't mate, and then they can't mate. And even if one of these new finches flies back over to this island, they can coexist with the original finch because they are exploiting different food sources. So they are not contradicting the limitation placed on this population, the original population, which is governed by the amount of food that is available. So having said all that, so, you know, the problem is still, okay, I see how we get faster gazelles, and I see how we even get a new finch. But how do I get from a fish to a bird? And the answer to that is you don't really get from a fish to a bird. Fish and birds are related through what we call their evolutionary history. In other words, long ago, in this case about 400 million years ago, birds and fish had a common ancestor. And that ancestor, 400 million years ago, split off millions of times into different species, all of them very similar to each other, but eventually very different. And one lineage led eventually to birds, and another lineage led to what we call modern day fish. This was not a modern day fish. So it's not a question of a modern fish turning into a modern bird. This ancestor, 400 million years ago, doesn't exist today. This is a different animal. And that animal split, and through natural selection and mutation and the processes of evolution, led to different lines of life. The first line it led to was this next one, which was amphibians. And maybe that's easier to understand how fish became amphibians. In fact, we recently discovered how fish became amphibians. In Greenland, they have, or I'm sorry, in northern Canada, they have discovered a transitional animal between fish and amphibians called tiktaalik, which is basically a fish, but whose front fins had developed wrists, so it could actually push its head up out of the water and eat insects along the banks of what were then inland rivers and sea. So, and then the head developed a neck and was able to turn and gather more food, and pretty soon the tiktaalik decided to walk up on and could walk up onto land for short periods of time, and then longer and longer, and we ended up with amphibians who still need to be near water because that's how they lay their eggs, and they are water dependent. If an amphibian dries out, it dies. Okay? So maybe it's easier to see how they got to amphibians first, but then, okay, now we're at amphibians, and now we get to reptiles. And then you go, okay, I can get from fish to amphibians. I might even get from fish to amphibians to reptiles, but I still don't know how you get to birds. And so let's take a closer look at this specific area of the tree of life, which is the reptiles: turtles, snakes, lizards, birds, and crocodiles. And here it is in its full glory, blown up. And the first thing you say is, okay, well, I can still see how a lizard, so there's lizards here, and maybe they, you know, a crocodile, okay, crocodile's like a giant lizard with teeth. I still don't know how you get to birds. Like, how do you get from what is basically a lizard crocodile animal to birds? And so we have to go in again. So let's look closely. There's dinosaurs. And you say, okay, but how do you get from dinosaurs to birds? I mean, it's easier to see how I get from reptiles and crocodiles to dinosaurs because, you know, they're scaly and reptiles and so forth. So let's take a look in here and see exactly what happened during the last period of the dinosaurs. This is the family tree of the dinosaurs. Thank you to Roger Benson, who has basically put together, you know, the 1,200 main families of dinosaurs. And you'll notice that up here, there's the main group is called Theropods, and down here, Ornithischia. So the Ornithischians are all herbivores, and there are a lot of the famous ones, like Triceratops and Stegosaurus and some others, Ankylosaurus. And then you have what are called the Theropods. And the Theropods include this subgroup called sauropods, and that's where you would get all the giant dinosaurs. This is what we used to call Brontosaurus, which we now call Apatosaurus and Brachiosaur and so forth. But what do you see up here? You see that the theropods also split off into the Tentanorae, and then the Coelurosaurians, and then the Paraes, and then Aves. And you'll notice that they're getting smaller. So when we say, yeah, but how can you get, I can get from a lizard to a crocodile, okay, I can get from a crocodile to a dinosaur. I can't get from a dinosaur to a bird. It's because people think of dinosaurs as these giant, even Tyrannosaurus Rex was 7 tons. Obviously, he wasn't flying. And, we think of dinosaurs as these giant monsters, yet the dinosaur family includes a lot of very small dinosaurs, the Paraes and the Coelurosaurians. And that's exactly what happened. We had neotheropods 220 million years ago develop into the Tentanoran family, and then into the Coelurosaurs, and then into what we now think of as the Dromaeosaurs, which developed feathers and were small, and pretty soon you had a bird. And so that's how you get all the way from fish to bird. You don't go from just fish to bird. You go from fish to amphibians, and amphibians to reptiles, and reptiles to dinosaurs, and then one line of dinosaurs to birds, and you end up with modern day birds. And here you see a depiction of the main changes that took place along that dinosaur bird family line. First, there were these small dromaeosaurs, and they evolved feathers for insulation. Archaeopteryx has feathers on its arms and learns to glide or jump for short distances. There's no question it was not a good flyer. If Archaeopteryx could fly at all, it was not a good flyer. It doesn't have the muscles for what's called the downstroke. So it wasn't until Confuciusornis, which is 50 million years later, that we see the sternum develop, where flight muscles attach. The sternum is that bone in your chest, where flight muscles can attach to power the downstroke necessary for controlled and sustained flight. Confuciusornis also developed the first beak. Yeah. In Ichthyosaurus, we see the first appearance of the sternal keel, which is a perpendicular bone to the sternum, which allows for really serious muscles to be attached and supported by the skeletal system. We don't have that. Only birds have that. And in modern birds, the continuing evolution of fused bones and aerodynamic feathers and stronger flight muscles result in what we see today in modern birds and how well they fly. So basically, that's how you get from fish to birds. It's a long route, but we've had 400 million years. So that's basically it. I want to leave you with this slide, which is VISTA, and the easiest way I can think of to remember the basic components of evolution. I did not come up with this. This is the American Museum of Natural History. Variation, inheritance, selection, time, and adaptation. In other words, in any given population, there's variation. And that variation is driven by mutation, recombinant DNA through sexual reproduction, and a few minor things like gene flow and horizontal gene transfer. But the point is that in any given population at any given time, there's a lot of variation. And that variation can be passed on to offspring. So if you're fast, your children will be fast. If you're tall, your children will be tall. This isn't always true, but it is statistically true. And then selection. So if there isn't enough resources for everyone to survive, and people have, or the individuals in these populations have different characteristics, obviously the ones with the characteristics that allow them to secure food, protect themselves and flee from predators and get mates will have the most offspring. And over time, what you see is the population adapt. And that's why we have to separate selection and adaptation. Selection happens at the individual level. An individual gazelle who is fast lives longer. But over time, the population of gazelles becomes faster, and that is adaptation. And over time, millions of adaptations can add up to speciation. And speciation over time is what has resulted in the incredible diversity of life we see on planet Earth today. There's over 2 million named species. Most scientists think there are at least 5 million species on planet Earth. Some think there may be 10 to 20 million. A lot of them are bugs. But anyway, they're still individual species. So that is, that's the main concepts of evolution and how we try to teach that or show that by telling Darwin's story of how he came up with natural selection and using dinosaurs as both the bookends to kicking off the modern evolutionary theory, because we realized that there was extinct animals, which was a wholly new concept, and that the earth was very old. And now that when we look at dinosaurs, we realize that's where birds came from. And we can trace that lineage through their skeletons, all the way from the dromaeosaurs, all the way up to modern birds. And I think I'm a little over on time, but I think we started a bit late. So I will stop talking now.
Well, thank you very much, Angus. Fantastic presentation. So what I'm going to propose right now for everybody is we're going to practice unmuting. Everyone go ahead and unmute yourselves. Or actually, maybe Ashley can just unmute all of you. And then we are going to, once we get there, offer Angus a round of applause. All right. Good work, everybody. And now we'll go ahead and open it up to questions. You're welcome to mute yourselves again if you like.
I'm not sure what mine's taking pictures of.
Is that a world record? No questions?
It happens once in a while. No one wants to start?
I'll start. I thought it was an extremely thorough and informative presentation, but I'm curious, Angus, on a personal level, where did you get involved with Darwin?
Well, it was quite a while ago, back in the early 90s. I've always been a scientist at heart, although I am a business person from a practical standpoint. And I thought I was interested in some of the great books in science. And so I started to collect a few of them, and I found a book called Horblett 100, which is a book about the most 100, the most important books ever published in science. And of course, it included Darwin and Newton and Copernicus and, you know, many others. Some books that are actually quite rare, and some books that everybody's heard of. And so I bought 3 or 4 of them. I got Pasteur's book on pasteurization, and I got Darwin's Origin. And I was in England, in London, and I went to one of the rare book dealers there. And he said, so, you know, I was just meeting him. And he said, so what are you doing? Collecting? And I said, well, I'm going to collect the Horblett 100. And he put his arm around me and he said, no, you're not. You can't possibly afford the Horblett 100. It's because some of the items in that 100 are so rare that the people, that if a copy ever came on the market, which they don't, but if they did, I'd be bidding against, you know, Bill Gates. So he said, you need to set a more modest goal. And so I already had 2 Darwin pieces, because there's the Origin of the Species, but there's also what's called the Darwin Wallace paper, which came out a year before then, which is in the exhibit as well, and which explained the basic theory of natural selection. And I thought, okay, I can't do the Horblett 100, because he explained, you know, there's a book in there by a Hungarian mathematician called János Bolyai. There's only like 2 copies in the world known, and they're both in libraries. And you know, it was a nice naive idea to collect the Horblett 100, but he explained to me that wasn't going to happen. And so I thought, all right, well, I'll go deep in Darwin, and I have. I have several thousand volumes now of Darwin, all of his books and papers, every issue published during his lifetime in 40 different languages. all the critics, all the reviews that were written during his lifetime, all the surrounding books on paleontology and so forth. And so that's how I ended up a Darwin collector. And then my partner, Mike Trebold, is a true digger. He owns the Rocky Mountain Dinosaur Resource Center in Woodland Park, Colorado, and he goes on digs. And I met him because I managed to get on a dig once. He didn't want to take anyone. We were at a conference in Tucson, and a friend of mine and I were there, and we said, well, can we come on a dig? And he said, no. And we said, oh, come on, you know, we don't snore and we'll be good, we'll help out. He said, no, they don't take amateurs into the field. You're nothing but a burden. And so we took him out to dinner, and 4 margaritas later, he said, okay, you can come to the field. And the next day he said he didn't remember. And it may be he didn't say it, I don't know. We may have made it up. It's like 30 years ago now. So I'm not even sure what happened. But anyway, he said, okay. And he took us out to the field. And he literally, his goal was to make it so awful that we would never come back. And so he would wake us up. We had to sleep in a shed on a rancher's property in South Dakota where they slaughter the buffalo. So it's filled with rats and blood and guts and everything. So we had to sleep in there, and he got us up every day at 4 a.m. and made us go into the field and work till like 9 p.m. till it was dark. And then he wouldn't give us any food. All he had was pork rinds and Pop-Tarts and potato chips. In fact, Terry, who was a girl, who was the other person that she and I have been friends since we were kids, she was the one who came on the dig. She was the one who introduced me to Mike, and it was the 2 of us that convinced him. She said in a supermarket, she can't even go in the aisle now that has Pop-Tarts because that experience was so awful. And but we found a Triceratops. So his plan backfired because we were in the field, and he thought, well, I'll just work him to death. And he damn near did. I mean, we were like, at the end of the week, we were like dead. You know, we looked like homeless people, and we hadn't had a shower. There's no water. There's no nothing, right? But on the 3rd day, we're scraping away, and we found a Triceratops skull. And that thrill, then, you know, then we were just like birds on a wool sock. Every year, we were like, we're coming out. Whether we know you're out there, we'll find you. So that's how I started. The Darwin and Dinosaurs exhibit started because in 2009, which was a big anniversary for Darwin, Mike has a dinosaur museum. I said we should do a joint Darwin and Dinosaurs exhibition. And he said, okay, bring some stuff. And so I loaded up some stuff, and we did the exhibit. And then we had other museums say, well, we'd like to have that. And we said, well, it isn't really an exhibit. It was just my stuff and Mike's stuff. So then we had to develop signage and interactives and games and more stuff. And now it's, you know, now it's a fun hobby. It's wonderful. That's how it started. That's a long answer, sorry.
No, it was great, thank you.
Well, I can ask a question, Angus. I've been waiting for someone else to chime in, but in the absence of that, so I'm curious. You talked a little bit about, and it's also in the exhibit in one of the films that we show from the HHMI, this notion of this couple that goes to the Galapagos now and is able to continue to track generation by generation natural selection in finches. And I'm wondering if you could elaborate on that just a little bit more. It just seems remarkable that we could do that generation upon generation still and have it be visible.
Yeah, and they're a remarkable pair. They're in their 60s or 70s now, but back in, it was literally late 70s that Peter and Rosemary Grant first went to Daphne Major because they were studying evolution in England. And they thought, well, we'll just go for a summer or 2 and take a look at the finches and see what we can find, do some field work, get some data. And they've gone back every year now for coming on 40 years. And they know all the birds, they've named them, they go, oh, there's Bob there, and they track them, they catch them, they put little color-coded tags on them. and they measure their beaks, and then they measure their offspring's beaks, depending on whether there's been drought or whether there's been other climatic changes in the seeds and the vegetation and so forth. And they've actually shown bird lineages, parent offspring lineages that show how beaks adapt. So when there's no big seeds, the ground finch sort of disappears because his whole business is eating the giant big seeds. And all of a sudden you see the small tree finches, which are still eating the insects, flourishing. And so you actually see, though, that the ground, I shouldn't say the ground finch disappears, but what happens is the ground finches end up with smaller and smaller beaks. Beaks are very expensive physiologically to produce. And so if you don't need it, you don't make it. If you need a smaller beak to actually eat other types of food sources, you end up watching. So they actually map. It's incredible. They're now revered in the scientific community. They've won all sorts of awards from the Royal Society and and everything else. The equivalent of whatever the Nobel Prize would be in evolutionary theory, they've won it because no one can even imagine what they've done. I mean, every year they go and they live in this little tent on this island, for 3 or 4 months and study the finches every year for 40 years. And they have shown what we call, it's not macroevolution. I mean, it's not a finch turning into a, dragon, right? But it is, it's microevolution showing that just in 2 or 3 generations, you can actually see physiological changes at that level. I mean, it's one thing to see antibiotic resistance, which happens at the bacterial level, but it's amazing to see physical changes in birds, year in and year out, that can be correlated to the weather and the food sources. So it's an incredible experiment, and they're too, they're funny, they're self-deprecating. They often say, we came here for a year, we thought we'd stay a year or 2, and I'm not sure they're actually going now, but other people are. In other words, they're basically an institution now, and I'm sure that there are, maybe younger field biologists out there on the islands today doing the same work to keep up that track. You don't want to break the data set now. They've created this incredible thing. It's got to be preserved. So yeah, they're an incredible pair, the 2 of them. And they catch each bird, and they have little things they put on them, and they have special little machines to measure their beaks and everything. It's incredible. It's yeah, you have one of the films about them, and it's an incredible story.
I'll pop in with a couple of 2 questions. Is there one particular island in the Galapagos that shows more evolutionary things than the other islands? And the other part, is there anywhere else in the world where you see this much of a dramatic evolutionary change in such a short time?
So the first question is, I think probably on Fernandina and Isabel, which are 2 of the larger islands, you see the most evolutionary change, partly because the islands are changing. They're still in the volcanic formation stage. And so they're actually creating new ecosystems all the time. So I think that you would see, and they have the most diverse ecosystems. They have mangrove forests on the shore, and they have lush forest up the sides of the hills, and they have arid ground in between. So I would think that that they have the most diverse ecosystems. Now, that may be a slightly different than the question you asked, which is where evolution is going on the most. Evolution would happen wherever there is the most ecological change, because it's change that jolts natural selection, right? So if gazelles can only get so fast, right? And then you top out. So a cheetah can go 60 or 70 miles per hour, but they can't go any faster because they overheat and they would die. So you reach what's called equilibrium. You reach, this is as fast as gazelles can go, and then everything sort of settles down. And it's not until the environment changes, that you have an ice age, or you have El Nino, local events, et cetera, that sort of put natural selection machinery back into action, because now you have a change, and it's whoever has the best characteristics to deal with that change that will survive and have the most offspring. So I would simply say it's those two islands on the west, because they're undergoing the most geological change right now, and they both have large multi-dimensional ecologies. And so there's got to be changes going on all over the place there. To your second, you're not allowed on either of those islands, oddly enough. Right. And in fact, the Galapagos, they're doing really well right now because no one's allowed there. And so they've actually, there was an article yesterday in the newspaper that the Galapagos research station, they're all thrilled, right? Because it's thriving. You know, they've got all their turtles are back, and, you know, everyone, and they're walking on the paths and they're having a great time, and the birds aren't afraid of it. Yeah, because they haven't had any visitors now for a month, and they're still closed. There's flights to the Galapagos, but not for people, just supply flights. For the people who live in the Galapagos. So all the animals are having a great, they say the same thing's happening in Africa. They say the lions are walking on the paths and they're going, look, they made a road for us, you know, and they're, you know, all the animals are thinking this is fantastic because the people are gone. So they're doing really well right now. But as far as another place, you know, every place has evolution going on at one level or another. The richest tend to be the rainforests because they're the densest. You know, they have life at every level. Like in the desert, there's life. There's no doubt about that. But it's sparse, right? There isn't much to support it. But in a rainforest, you know, you've got everything you need. You got food, and you've got prey, and you've got water, and you've got, you know, a mild temperature, and you've got all sorts. You've got amphibians and reptiles and mammals and birds. So you tend to see the richest ecosystems in the rainforest. So if I were going to go out and look, which I have done, into the, you know, I would go to rainforests, and they're beautiful. They have the really colorful and rich. You know, every square inch is used. You know, there's a life form in every niche, which is fascinating in the rainforest. You're wearing an American Dog Derby shirt. You know that all dogs are the same species.
Yes. Oh.
Yeah. I mean, and it's amazing, right? Because you think of a Mastiff versus a Chihuahua, and they're actually the same species. But that's one of the great, they think that dogs were probably the first domesticated animal. Before elephants, before any of the agricultural animals, that the wolves first gathered around, you know, human encampments and looking for scraps of food, and some of them were friendly enough that they could be tolerated, and off we go. We have dogs.
Do you know, I think years, I mean, way back in my ancient history, if someone had taught me or read a book or something that said they thought that the wolves and dogs basically evolved from seals. Is there any, do you have any knowledge?
No, I don't think that. No, I don't think that's right. I think that the dogs definitely evolved from gray wolves, probably in Northern Europe originally, and the canine family is part of the, you know, terrestrial mammal family. You might be thinking of whales actually came from bears. And, you know, there are some crazy things like that where animals that were land animals became marine animals. And so you have almost a circle, right? Because it was we all started in the sea, as they say, got onto land, and then, you know, we had, it's not considered to be retrograde evolution, because evolution doesn't have a direction or a goal. It's only trying to, you know, the forces of evolution simply try to perfect animals to their environment, right? To optimize the animal's survival ability in an environment. And so as that environment changes, the rules of natural selection change. And the marine environment presented a great amount of food, and so we have animals that actually became land animals and then evolved again and became marine animals. The closest relative of the elephant apparently is the manatee, which is, you know, these are crazy things. You know, you can't even imagine how that could be true, and yet when they do the molecular DNA, there's no doubt about it. Or the dugong. It may not be the manatee, it may be the dugong, but it's that family. Right? So that is, you know, that's amazing when you think about how evolution has spread out and speciated across the earth, across all these different environments, and then remembering that you have hundreds of millions of years of time. So all of those environments were different at different times. And so all of that works together to create all of this change and all of these different species. And now we have millions of species on the planet. Unfortunately, we're not being really good stewards right now in some ways. And hopefully that will improve. You know, I think people realize now more than ever, this generation, you know, each generation gets more and more concerned and more active about the environment. And that's part of education and part of social awareness. So,
Thank you.
You're welcome. Have you been to the exhibit?
Yes.
All right.
Yeah, several times. It's been awesome.
Great. My little keyboard here says there's 24 participants. There has to be more questions.
I was going to ask you a question, Angus. Thank you for describing my blue eyes, or rather my clear eyes, and giving me some perspective on that. I wonder if you could speak to other variations like hazel eyes, or, I mean, I think I get green eyes, but maybe speak a little, can you speak about hazel eyes?
Yeah, it's all a function of the levels of melanin. So if there's basically no melanin, you have blue. And if you have some melanin, then, or a lot of melanin, you have brown, and you get variations in brown. And hazel is really a variation of brown eye. And then green is sort of in between. It's like you don't have enough, you get some of the structural blue color mixed with brown, and that's what produces green. It's not actually a green color any more than blue is a blue color, right? So blue is the most, is where both of the HERC2 genes have the mutation. You're a mutant.
That is clear.
I'm not going to comment, but the thought is there.
I handed you an easy one there, Rod. So you see variation in brown and hazel because it's just a different levels of melanin. And then when you have basically no melanin going to the eyes, you end up with structural blue. So yeah, it's not like we all have, there's only, it's not, and there's different colors of blue, right? I mean, even, you know, you see this because even though it's structural color, there's still, you know, in the eye, and I'm not an eye expert, but in the structure of the eye, you can still have different thicknesses and different levels and different refractions and so forth. And so you can get either a deep blue or a light blue. And it's the same with brown and green. All of that is a mixture of how much melanin is produced. And it's not just the HERC2 gene where you need the binding site. OCA2 can produce different levels of melanin to begin with, just because you're geared and wired to produce different levels of melanin. So that's probably why you get different levels of brown eye. Yeah, it's one of the amazing things because they've, and I can't attest to this. I've looked into it briefly so that I could incorporate it into this presentation. But the current thinking is that all blue-eyed people go back to one person 7,000 years ago in Europe. That you're all related on a strict family line, because they figure that the odds of that HERC2 gene mutation happening twice are just 0. So,
You did trace my family tree then.
right, right. And the reason that you see so many today, I mean, this is a striking example of advantage, but not advantage in evading predators or getting food, but an advantage in mating, because the theory is that that novelty was so noticeable and so attractive that blue-eyed people, you know, were in high demand.
That's fascinating. So I may be a mutant according to Rod and whatever, but in high demand perhaps at one time.
We're in high demand. That's right, blue eyes, and that's why it took off. Because normally, when something like that happens, it's preserved in the genetic record of modern people, but it's usually recessive, right? But blue eyes, you know, there's now, as I said, I forget the exact number, but in Scandinavia and Denmark, blue eyes, it's like, it's in the 30–40%. It's huge. It's not like over here where every now and then you see someone with blue eyes. It's in some Northern European communities and populations, blue eyes are the dominant color. So, and that's amazing, right? Because that really had to take off to end up that way, right?
Yeah, it's really interesting.
Yeah.
I have another hypothetical question, so to speak. You know, when I look at an elephant, I just got through looking at 100,000 elephants, they all basically look alike. Or you look at, you know, warbler or, you know, different bird species, they all look alike. What is unique to human, you know, when I look at apes, chimpanzees, gorillas, they all pretty much look alike. What is unique about humans other than, you know, twins and triplets that virtually every one of us looks different?
Well, that's interesting because it's really a function of perspective. So now, you know, it's impossible to talk to an ape, but if you could, right, I think he would say, why do we all look different and all the humans look the same? So within a species, they can tell the size, like tiger stripes, for instance, are a famous example, right? I mean, we look at tigers and, you know, it's a tiger, right? It's got black and orange stripes, right? But the striping on a tiger, every one is like a fingerprint. And every tiger recognizes tigers that it has either met before or doesn't know, and recognizes them by their scent and by their stripes. So, and that's why I used, when talking about variation, I thought it would be easier to talk about variation without getting into the human component, because we sort of distort natural selection because we have all sorts of ways of dealing with the environment, the animals, that the natural animal, you know, we're all not part of the natural world, but we are an exception in the sense that we're tool users and language users and so forth. And so animals can't, you know, if they run out of food, they can't go to Walmart. So, you know, it's different for them. And I thought about using animals as the example of variation, but the only time you really see variation is in humans. Like, we recognize it in humans because we need that capacity to know who we've dealt with before, to remember whether they're friend or foe, or whether they're kin or not, or all the things that go into relationships between a single species. All we need to know about tigers is that they're black and orange and to stay the hell away from them, right? That's, you know, there's like, we don't, oh, that's Bob. No, it doesn't matter, right? It's a tiger and it will eat me if I get anywhere near it. And so we have almost no individual recognition capabilities for other species. We fear all spiders because some are venomous, and we learned that, you know, stay away from spiders because some are venomous. Who cares which ones, right? It wasn't until the last 50 years that we knew which ones were venomous. But for hundreds and thousands of years, humans have been afraid of spiders because that's a selected trait. You're more likely to live if you're afraid of spiders, right? And but we don't distinguish. We don't go, oh yeah, that's the you know, Terribilis. You know, we just go, hey, it's a spider, get away, kill it. So we don't have the capability to distinguish really between species. In fact, even with dogs, I mean, you can distinguish between subbreeds of dogs, yes, obviously. But if you don't know a dog and I gave you two terriers, now you're wearing a dog shirt, so you probably could. But most people would meet two similar looking Scottish Terriers and wouldn't be able to tell you. And if you presented the two later, they couldn't tell you which was A and which was B. All right. You only have that ability within your species. And I think that's true for animals as well. And there is some science behind that. I mean, they can show that animals recognize predators better than they recognize other animals that they haven't run into before. I mean, there's some basic logic that can be shown in certain experiments, but I think it's pretty true that, you know, within your own population, it's critical, you know, who's who. Like wolves in a wolf pack. I mean, you got to know who's head wolf, or you're going to get in trouble. So, you know, we look at them and we see the same thing, but they don't. They see each individual as a unique profile. I don't think they give them names.
Kind of like zebras when we were in Africa, the difference between them, that one has black stripes and white stripes, and the other one has white stripes and black stripes.
Yeah, I mean, you know, you can't tell a zebra from a zebra, but zebras can, because they know who, you know, they know who are the nice zebras and who are the family zebras and who are the gangsters. So I think that within species, it's purely a species level capability.
Thank you.
So if you don't mind, I'm going to step in real quick and just say, because we're about at 90 minutes now, if anyone would like to stick around and keep talking, more than welcome to. But if you've got to go, don't feel bad. We are grateful for your participation, everybody. Thanks for coming, and we'll see you soon.